Welcome to our last lecture of our Unit 2 Ancient Near East series, where we will be discussing the Assyrian Empire. On your handout, I have one image labeled as Neo-Assyrian. Just note that that's referring to the late empire, and you can refer to both as Assyrian. So, hopefully you watched the video over the background information of this empire, and note that this is the origin of even our modern day understanding of empires. And so we're going to study a few of the artworks associated with it. So we believe these are called the llamasu, and it's a winged bull with a human head. And so I'm going to give you a moment to pause and scan over this image and consider elements that are familiar to you and elements that are new to you. Okay, so hopefully what stands out to you is likely the horned headdress at the top. We just covered the Code of Hammurabi, and we noted how Shamash was wearing a horned headdress, and that signified that he was a deity. And so we're seeing that here again. These are familiar iconographical motifs that would have been recognizable by people entering the city. We see the horns, it's an elaborate headdress. Those small little circular flowers are called rosettes. There's these feather details at the top of the headdress. It's elaborate, it's important, it's valuable. So this is attesting to the importance of this deity. The eyes are also emphasized. We've seen that throughout the ancient Near East, beginning with the ancient Sumerians. We see a beard, which denotes power. And then what's new, of course, is the composite of the human head and the bull body, noted by the hooves. And we know that bulls are powerful symbols. This deity also has wings, so this is new. Now let's discuss why. We have to understand the context first. So this is from the citadel of Sargon II. The empire was at its most expansive. And around the city center, the administrative political center of this empire, there would have been a massive wall. Of course, we've seen this in other city-states, and especially here. And so on this wall, they had many, many relief sculptures. Here we're seeing just a few of them. We have examples of low relief, see the figures, and our llamasu that is high relief. Now, there are 7 entrances to the city, and at each of these entrances, we have 2 llamasu. So every person that's entering is going to pass beside these 2, and they're massive. Other different empires, this becomes familiar. So other empires are going to use these images, but here's one similar to one that we're looking at. You can see the mud brick wall beside it. You can see its height. Here's some others in a different museum. We'll study the Persian Empire, and they reuse this motif. Here's an image of its removal when they brought this to the Louvre, one of them. Another example. Head is turned. And so this is our wing-headed bull at the Louvre Museum in Paris that we're looking at. Now, as you're passing through, you come up to this llamasu, and initially it's standing upright, it's facing forward, it is in an intimidating stance. The eyebrows protrude out because consider how if you were in front of it and looking upward, those furrowed brows will mimic focus or almost to the extent of anger, so that you are intimidated, essentially. You are meant to be intimidated. Now also note how many legs the llamasu has. It actually has 5 legs, because the artistic intention is as you're walking up, you see the 2 that's standing tall, and then as you're walking by it, you see its profile, and then it seems to be as if it's moving. So that from different perspectives, it looks whole and it looks intimidating. Now, with that aspect of movement, That's part of its intention, part of the message, which is described underneath the legs in cuneiform, which you could read as you were entering, is that if you had any ill intentions when entering this city, that this llamasu, this deity, would fly across the city, pick you up, and basically take you away to torture you. It was an explicit, written out threat. Now, it wasn't just against the people entering the city, it was also against other ill-willed deities who would be entering the city. Remember, all of our different city-states are supported by their own patron deity. So we have a deity who is warning both the visible humans and the invisible spirits that if they have any ill intentions or deceit upon entering the city, they will face retribution in a violent manner. So these llamasu are essentially guardian figures. They're warnings. I want to introduce, I came to this slide for the term apotropaic. So that specifically is in regard to how these are warning the spiritual world as well. We see that later with like temples that are made and other civilizations, how they'll have some type of image on it that's specifically meant to ward off ill intentions of gods or spirits, etc. So this is apotropaic in that essence. Now let's look at a close-up of the face and talk about the figure style for a moment for practice of formal analysis. Notice how we have the defined eyebrows. Think of how we saw that with our head of an Assyrian ruler, Akkadian ruler, excuse me. We have the individualized nose. We have the volume of the rounded cheeks. But then we have a stylized beard. This is not a realistic beard. It is stylized. But it's aesthetically pleasing. Same with the hair. It's stylized, but it looks good. Note that the ears are that of a bull. And he's wearing elaborate earrings. So again, attesting to the value of this individual. So here's some other examples. And here we have our llamasu. Let's move on to the relief with Ashurbanipal killing a lion. And I love this one because it's such a culmination of many of the aspects that we've been discussing from the beginning of this unit. So I'll give you another moment. Pause, consider what's familiar and what's new. So it's likely that you recognize the elements that we've seen of the beard representing power, the eyes are emphasized. There's also a hierarchy of scale, where our main figure, Ashurbanipal, is larger than the soldier behind him. We see the beard that denotes his power, his strength, and we're seeing the woven cap that was first originally from the Sumerians. Think of our Gudea, where he reuses this motif in our Neo-Sumerian style, and Ashurbanipal chose to use this motif as well, versus like an elaborate headdress. His clothing is extremely decorative. We see those rosette motifs again, those little circular flowers. Now note that let me back up. Every aspect and element of this entire image is extremely intentional. Compare him to Ashurbanipal to his minion behind him. He purposefully looks smaller. He looks rounder. He's not as muscular. His clothing has very little detail to it compared to Ashurbanipal. That contrast really makes Ashurbanipal stand out more. Also look at the muscles on his arm and how there's this real emphasis of strength. This artist would have been capable of creating an extremely realistic human figure. We see that in the muscles of the arm. We see that with the emphasis of the aspects of the lion, of the figure behind him, etc. But he's specifically choosing to depict Ashurbanipal this way for specific reasons. And so here we have our domestic versus wild, and the culmination of it, if you will. We saw this at the very beginning of this idea of conquering the wild, that the domesticated civilization can conquer the wild. And we're seeing it here. Compare it to our wild lion. It's ferocious. Look at the muscles that are emphasized, the claws, etc. The screaming of either anger or anguish, etc., but this very contorted face. It's extremely emotional. Versus Ashurbanipal and his soldier, who are in full control of their emotions. Their lack of expression, their stoicism, helps to re-emphasize this idea of civilization bringing about order, and thus domestic conquering the wild. He is in control of his emotions. In real life, if you were trying to fight a lion, despite it being shot with an arrow and stabbed in the gut with your sword, you'd probably have some type of emotional expression on your face. But Ashurbanipal is so in control, represents civilization so well, that he has no reaction to this conquering of the lion. And this attests to his power. The lion, the fact that he is shown very muscular with these claws and ferocious, also further emphasizes how Ashurbanipal was beating a formidable foe. If they had just shown a weak lion, it wouldn't have made Ashurbanipal look as great by comparison. But I really love this image as our example of domestic versus wild in such a visual format. So there we have it. Here's close up. Here's another example. He's firing these soldiers are firing their weapons at this lion, despite it being hit by several arrows. Everyone's in control. They're about to win, etc., etc. So this wild versus the domesticated civilization is very apparent here. Okay. So let's move into Persia. This was an extensive, powerful, detailed empire. I'm going to try my best to keep it into a short bullet point format. There would be a lot to talk about. Several kings are mentioned in the informational videos that you've watched. It was an extensive empire. You've probably heard of it. And we're going to talk about Darius the Great. So he deserves the name the Great. Let's talk about the religion. In fact, I'll start with that. So this is one of the oldest religions in existence, still practiced today by a select few or by a small group. But I like this quote by PBS NewsHour when there's an article about it. At its core, Zoroastrianism, I probably just butchered that, sorry, emphasizes a never-ending battle between good and evil, a contest between the religion's god, Ahura Mazda, and an evil spirit, Ahriman. Believers have the freedom to make good or bad choices. They were exhorted by Zoroaster to think good thoughts, say good words, and do good deeds. Now, I like this quote because we have to remember there is no difference or separation between political, military, and religious life in daily life. All of them are connected. All of them are one and the same. And so what we're going to see with this empire is this idea of good words, good deeds, good thoughts comes to fruition. So here's the audience hall, the Apadana that we're studying, or at least here's an artistic recreation, which was started under Darius the Great. So he expanded the empire, and I want us to get out of the context of our Assyrian empire and that conquering, displacement of people, etc., chaos of that empire. And instead, Darius, he embraces all these different cultures and places that he brings into his empire. I don't even necessarily want to use the word conquer because it has such a negative connotation compared to what Darius did. And so the city of Persepolis is the ceremonial, and administrative capital of the empire at this time period. This was actually a Greek name given to them. later on by Greek historians. It's located in modern-day Iran, so it has city dates to archaeological remains to 515 BCE. The Persians called it Parsa. But let's talk about Darius the Great and how he directed this massive building program. And so we see the layout here. We have palaces, we have a council hall, we have a great tomb, a throne hall, a treasury, these massive gates, etc. And so what we're going to be focusing on is just the Apadana, this audience hall. And it was looted and sacked and burned down by Alexander the Great and his men in 330 BCE, marking the end of the Persian Empire. So let's talk about the Apadana, or the audience hall. This is where they would receive their guests, or those who were bringing tributes to the administrative center of this empire. And I want to introduce a new art history term that we'll see play out in the next few units, and the concept of a hypostyle hall. And what that refers to is basically this column, this roof held up by many, many columns. That's essentially what it is. And so our Apadana is an example of a hypostyle hall. You can see some of the remains in the lower right corner image. Your exam image looks very similar to the lower right, where we see the grand staircase with this low relief image in front that would lead up to this Apadana. And so it's an audience hall. It's where he would receive every foreigner, essentially. So again, like our llamasu, every aspect of this will have a specific message for these visitors. It's going to show the grandeur of the empire, the wealth of the empire, but it's also going to welcome them in a unique way that we haven't seen yet. Oh, here's a Kylexa base showing some of the defeat. Here's an early old black and white image. You can see the figure in the far left to have a glimpse of how massive this structure was. And so as you walk up, we see some familiar elements. So we have our conquering, formidable, more stylistic lions that are defeating these other goat bulls. But what I want to focus on are all of these figures. So we have the larger figures, we have smaller figures of these reliefs. And they're depicting all different types of cultures and peoples and city-states bringing their tributes to this capital. So here's an example of some Assyrians with their rams that they're bringing. Oh, there's a bull capital. We'll get into that. Here's part of the East Stairway. Here's some other individuals. And so start to notice how there are different elements and characteristics that help to differentiate between these different people in the goods that they're bringing. So pay attention to his hair, his cap, his beard. These figures versus these figures. Look how different each one is. Even from the length of the beards, the style of the beards. Look at how these different figures are carrying different forms of tribute, different valuable goods. And so what they've done is they've shown diversity. Darius the Great, he respected these other cultures that he conquered. He allowed them to still practice their religions. He allowed even the city-states to basically keep their own authority. They governed themselves to an extent. And so they just had to primarily pay tribute to Darius, and he would welcome them. Now let's compare this to our llamasu, which was this very intimidating figure that any type of people bringing tributes would walk upon. But here we have images not only of a diverse array of different types of people, but people will recognize themselves in these images. So that sends such a different message. It's a message of welcome, in other words. It attests to the diversity and the inclusion of the Persian Empire. So even above the gates, I forgot to mention, it says the gates of all nations. So consider how that announces the seat of the empire, but it welcomes everyone. Darius II welcomes them. Of course, he will still depict himself as larger than the other figures. Our hierarchy of scale is in use. And so if you'll remember with our Shamash, we talked about how important figures will be depicted seated, and their feet will be above ground. So notice how his feet are on a pedestal. And here is an artistic reconstruction. So here, if you look at the top of these columns, we find these massive bull motifs, which of course are familiar. They represent power. All of these would have been painted. In ancient Greece, everything was painted. Ancient Rome, everything was painted. These bright, almost gaudy colors. So just note that it's been lost, but they would have been extremely colorful. Head back to that. Sorry, these are out of order. Our bull capital. So the capital is the top of the column, and this bull motif is extremely representative of just the Persians. We're not going to see that type of column in ancient Greece primarily, etc. But I want to bring our attention to, again, the bull, this culmination of these symbols that are used throughout the ancient Near East. And, of course, to celebrate our Persian Empire. It was begun by, or at least this extensive building project by Darius the Great, and why he deserves the name.